Hello and welcome to this new session of the Digital Publishing Summit 2023. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Marie-Laurence and I'm a member of the organizing team at EDRLab. So we are excited to have you join us today for this session. This session is on guided audio navigation in comics and is presented by our two speakers, Hadrien Gardeur, head of product at Marque, where he manages the entire product portfolio, which includes distribution, retail, marketplace for libraries, portal for public libraries, portal for school, reading apps. He's also a board member of both EDRLab and the Readium Foundation. We also have with us Morten Sjøgren, a senior developer at Nota, whose duty include developing the last 3 generations of their reader platforms. I would like to thank them for being part of this event. In this session, we will explore the ongoing effort within the Readium community to create a new reading experience for comics, manga, and webtoon. So here, Hadrien and Morten are going to tell us about a world where comics will become accessible to everyone and work equally well on tablets, smartphones, smart speakers, etc. So get ready for this discussion. And for this discussion, I want to thank again our sponsor, the Readium Foundation, Glassbox, Audioboot, and the Marque, represented here by Hadrien Gardeur, as well as our partner, Fondation Elia, for collaborating on all the accessibility sessions. I want you to remember also that this session is being recorded, and for our EDRLab members, they will receive a written synthesis at the end of the summit. You can feel free to ask your question in the Q&A box, which is just in the bottom. And now I'm giving the floor to Hadrien and Morten. Thank you all.
Really, this is working as expected. So thank you for the introduction. I'm the head of product at Marque. I'm going to go very quickly through what we do at Marque and the Readium Foundation. That's just a quick reminder. But if you're interested in Readium, I highly recommend participating to the call, the presentation that's going to happen on Thursday, made by Michael Menu. He'll do a much better presentation, much longer presentation about Readium than what I'll be doing today. So just a quick reminder. So at Marque, we have a pretty straightforward mission statement. We connect people and creators across the world, so culture can easily thrive everywhere. And as you've heard in the introduction, there's quite a lot we do in terms of the way we connect people. We connect people not just by selling content, but also by operating public libraries and schools. And so we think this project is really interesting for some of those markets, especially in terms of schools. So last year, I presented what I called a slightly revised mission statement for the Readium Foundation. So the initial mission statement for Readium Foundation was to foster the development of an open and modern collaborative playground for digital reading technologies. And my proposal was to replace that by digital publishing. So more and more Readium Foundation is producing not just reading solutions, toolkits that can be used to build reading apps, but it's also involved in the creation of technology that can be used by distributors, by content creators. So that's not really what I'm going to be focusing on today. But as you'll see, it's a trend that we've continued this year. And hopefully we'll continue to do as well in the next few years. So I don't know how many of you love this movie, but I love it very much. And for those of you who knew the dance, I will ask you to do the time warp right now and all go back to 2022 when I did a presentation about Readium during Reimagine and Digital Publishing Summit in Madrid. So one of my last slides in that presentation last year was about what we were planning on doing next for Readium. So I'm going to do a quick reality check of where we are and some of the things we presented. So one of the things I mentioned last year is that we were about to do a lot more with regards to accessibility metadata. And we've really accomplished that work in Readium. We've done a lot in terms of extracting accessibility metadata, inferring that data. I did a presentation about that in Madrid not so long ago, and hopefully we'll be able to present more. So that's a check, something we've achieved. Another thing we mentioned is better support for screen readers. We've been working on that, but it's been quite challenging with some of the limitations that we encounter on Android and iOS. So we're kind of still struggling with that on the Readium side, but still working on it. And the big one we've mentioned that I'm going to be talking about today is media overlay, because we've wanted to do media overlay in Readium for quite a long time. And of course, we're still working also on having more and more documentation, but as we all know, this takes time, and this is something you can constantly improve. So there has been more documentation, but we can still do a little bit more. So what about media overlay? So media overlay has existed in EPUB for quite a long time. So what you're seeing here is the member submission that was submitted to W3C when all the EPUB work moved from IDPF to W3C. But we've had media overlay as part of EPUB, well, the satellite specs of EPUB for a long time now. Here, I think it's labeled as 2017, but it goes actually a few years back before that when it was first introduced. But it's always been a bit challenging for us when it comes to implementing Readium in Readium media overlay, because we always felt that this was something that was kind of shifting, moving around. So I think all the way back to 2018, 2019, we kind of tried to do what we always do in Readium, which is think of something a bit more abstract in terms of API that developers could use to implement support for media overlay. And we came up with something that is very basic and which actually has been implemented in Thorium. So that's basically what's in Thorium right now for those of you using that app on Windows, macOS, or Linux. And that's how media overlay got added to Thorium. But there were a lot of other discussions. So whenever we were trying to figure out a good way of handling media overlay, there were always change happening. So at some point there was, for example, a lot of discussion around potentially refreshing media overlay and replacing them with something more modern or tweaked. So there was, for example, a community group report specifically on that called Synchronized Media for Publications, which is part of the publications community group that anyone can join. I think I saw Lars actually on the call, yeah, listening to that. So there were a lot of that, and it was always kind of hard for us to figure out, should we wait? Should we do something new? Should we were always a bit hesitating when it came to the right way of implementing media overlay. And when we started working on that again, let's say about a year ago, we kind of wondered if actually media overlay were used at all. So thanks to the work we've done on accessibility, we've been able to take a look at how widely available media overlay actually are. So we've looked at over 500,000 EPUB files. And what we've seen in this 500,000 EPUB files is that we only had about a bit more than 300 publications in French with media overlay, 201 in Italian, and less than 50, actually 44 of them in Spanish. So we haven't looked at the English, so US or UK produced content, or Canadian. We think there's going to be a bit more, but it was kind of disappointing to see so very few files implementing media overlay at all. And what we saw is that media overlay are mostly used for juvenile fiction. So usually for pretty advanced layouts. So your typical layout is you have something that's highly illustrated on the right or on the left, and then you have some text, accompanying text on the other part of the spread. And what we saw too is that in EPUB at least, this is only used in fixed layout, which kind of felt like a wasted opportunity. We really feel, looking at those numbers, we're kind of disappointed. And we felt that it's kind of a wasted opportunity because although media overlay make a lot of sense for juvenile fiction, for kid books, it could be useful for other types of book. We know that there are types of content that people like to listen in using audiobooks. And there's no good reason why you can do a reflowable EPUB with media overlay as well. I have both of them actually in the same file. And what we saw by looking beyond EPUB is that there's a lot of production of content where text and audio are synchronized, but most of that production is still happening in DAISY. So for example, Morten's organization or other similar organization, they still produce a lot of DAISY audiobook or DAISY files where you have both text and audio. But in EPUB, weirdly enough, it's mostly restricted to fixed layout, which has its own set of problems for accessibility and juvenile fiction. Another thing that we've kind of realized while working again on media overlay for Readium is that there was another spec that was actually published as part of a group within IDPF that was called the Advanced Hybrid Layout Working Group. And this working group created a spec called EPUB Region-Based Navigation 1.0. So I was one of the author of that spec a while back too. And what this spec does is that it provides a way for highly illustrated publication. So here it's an example with comics, for example. So it provides a way to divide a page or a spread into regions. So here you have a good example of that. You can see you have the P1, P2 regions that are entire panels, but you also have sub-region within the panel. For example, the R1 region you have here is a region where you see the face of a character, you have some description of what's happening, whereas the R3 region has a speech bubble included as well. So while media overlay is based on SMIL, S-M-I-L, this is based on the navigation document. So the same thing you use in EPUB for table of contents, same thing you use for page list, index, landmarks. So more of an HTML flavor than an XML flavor. And basically allows you to create panel by panel navigation or guided navigation for comics. The spec uses that a lot for comics, but it could be used for kid books. It could be used for recipe cookbooks. It could be used for potentially anything in FXL. And you have a good example of what the syntax looks like below that. So looking at those two things, the media overlay and region-based navigation, what we started realizing is that they have a lot in common. So one of the things that they both have in common is that they're both about fragments in a resource or in a spread. So usually in EPUB, we are always manipulating resources like an entire HTML file or an SVG, both are allowed. But we don't work that often in EPUB with a fragment. And in both cases here, we're working with fragments. For example, in the media overlay, you have the HTML fragment of a reflowable EPUB that is synchronized with the audio fragment of an audio track. So they both have that in common. Another thing that they both have in common is that they both provide guided navigation. So instead of the usual reading experience that you have with an EPUB, you can think of those two specs as providing you another way of navigating in the content. Instead of doing, instead of having a tap to directly go to the next page, for example, in FXL, you might have 4 or 5 taps or key involved before you get to the next page, because you're guided within a page or within a thread to see more details. Same thing for media overlay. It's a bit more passive, but it's also very guided in that regard. And in the case of region, this actually goes beyond the natural reading order. So typically in EPUB, you just follow the spine and you have, chapter 1 in the spine and chapter 2, chapter 3. and it's kind of hard to go back and forth within the spine. But in the case of region-based navigation, since you have spreads, it's possible that the guided navigation experience will display something on page 2, and then something on page 3, and then go back to page 2, and then display something that's both on page 2 and 3. So that's also something interesting. Another thing that they have in common is that they don't have to cover the entire publication. For example, media overlay, maybe you don't want to have a media overlay for the introduction or the cover page, but you might want to have media overlay for specific pages where they're needed. Guided navigation are kind of the same. Let's say you're reading region-based navigation, kind of the same. Let's say you're reading a comic and then something is full page. Maybe you don't need to add subregions. Maybe it's fine just having the entire page, which means no need to add information there. And finally, they're both associating a fragment to something else. So we're going to go into a bit more details about that. So I know fragments can be a bit confusing, but let me explain a bit what we mean by fragments. So by fragment, there's one thing a lot of you already know, is that in HTML, we have the ability to indicate identifier in the HTML, and then reference that using the hash sign and then the reference. So that's typically, that's a very good example of a fragment and one that is widely used in EPUB production. Another example that you can have of a fragment is a time-based fragment. So let's say that you have an audio track and you have a sentence that is of interest in that audio track. Using the fragment that you can see on screen, you can actually say, start at 10 seconds into the audio track and finish at, let's say, 40 seconds. So there is an ability using time-based fragments to either indicate the beginning of something or a range, so the beginning and the end of a fragment. Very useful also for audiobooks, especially when you're building table of contents for audiobooks. And the last one that you can also have are spatial fragments. So in the case of an image, using the fragment you can see on screen, it's possible to say, start at a specific position, and then, for example, cover 25% in both height and width, starting from that position. So using spatial fragment, that's how we can actually draw the kind of rectangular shapes you could see in the region-based navigation spec. And actually, the region-based navigation spec introduced additional shapes that are not covered as part of the W3C fragment URI spec. For example, polygons or more complex shape that you might want to be using. So the other point that was important is associations. So we already have a few examples where we associate different media using fragments or using something else in the fragment in the case of EPUB. A very good example of that is alternate text. It's something that is widely used now to produce accessible content, but it's something that's built in within HTML. You don't need to add XML or navigation or whatever to do that. So you associate an image to a text equivalent using alt or using a long description. Another good example that's also kind of baked in where you don't have to do anything is we have support for subtitles in video. So that's another example of an association. You have video and you associate actually a specific time fragment in a video to text. Another good example of association within EPUB are media overlays. So media overlay are kind of similar to the two examples above in the sense that you associate an HTML fragment to an audio fragment. So based on what I showed you before in the previous slide. And the last one, this one is not really known, but there is also within EPUB, so within the satellite spec of EPUB and the work that was done in AHL, there's something called rendition mapping. And with that, it's also possible, for example, to indicate that a portion, so a fragment of an FXL page is actually connected to a reflowable equivalent. So let's say you have a newspaper or a magazine with a pretty complex layout for a newspaper. You could indicate that what you can see in the FXL version of that has a reflowable equivalent, which is going to be much better for accessibility because the text is available for screen readers, because you can change the text and all that. So that one is not really known, but it's another good example of association. So with these two slides, this gives you a good idea of what we mean by fragments and associations. But one that is often missing is audio with image. So what if I had an image and that for that image, I had multiple fragments to divide that image into smaller components and audio associated to that. That seems to be something that could be useful, but that is not covered by the things I've listed on this slide. So thinking of all those things, so looking at media overlay, looking at region-based navigation, looking at some of the higher level concepts, this helped us go to a place where instead of thinking of those things as separate, media overlay, it's one thing, region-based, it's another thing, we did something that we often do in Readium, which is we try to think of a higher level concept that actually applies to many different things. And that's kind of how we came up with the concept of guided navigation in Readium. So what do we mean by guided navigation in Readium? Guided navigation in Readium is basically a different way to navigate through a publication. So it could be the ability to do panel by panel reading if you're reading a comics. It could be the ability to have audio read alongside those panels you're watching. It could be many different ways also of navigating through the publication, not necessarily following the reading order, because for this guided navigation, the reading order might not be the best or the most optimal way of experiencing the publication. We focused this effort on 3 media for now. Text. So for text, we already had an easy way of working with text fragments, with reference. But another thing we want to cover as part of this guided navigation work in Readium is we also want to cover strings, and I'll explain that a bit later. The second media that we want to support as part of this guided navigation API in Readium is the support for image. And by that, I mean not just full images, but also fragments. So basically what I showed you for region-based navigation. And last but not least, we also want to support audio. So audio could be a full resource. For example, you could have a very short audio track that describes an image or that describes a page, or you could have much longer audio track where you want to divide that track into smaller fragments and just reference those, which is very similar to the way people usually work with media overlay. And so basically the way we see this, we think that guided navigation in Readium is kind of a superset that is built on top of media overlay and region-based navigation. So it means that for people, so for developers implementing this API that will be added to the Readium toolkits, they won't really have to think, oh, this book has media overlay, or oh, this book has region-based navigation. For those implementers, it will be one and the same. We'll expose everything as guided navigation, which is why we think it's a superset. It's also a superset because we're interested in looking at media that are not well covered by EPUB yet. And we think we can do both. We think it's always a good way of doing something that makes it easy enough or easier to integrate for implementers, and at the same time try to push boundaries a bit more and see what we can do if we think a little bit beyond what exists in EPUB right now. So this work actually started more actively in terms of specifying what the API could look like earlier this year. So we've been having calls with a number of organizations, including Nota, so Morten is going to explain why, EDRLab. We haven't really written a full documentation or a full spec, but we have a very high level summary of what this looks like. So that's what I'm showing on screen. I'm not going to bother everyone with JSON today. That's not the goal of this presentation. But you can very quickly see what it looks like. So we have reference to images, reference to text, reference to audio. We have the ability to also include a text equivalent. So if there's no reference in HTML you can also embed the text straight into that. And we have the ability to convey roles. So that was also part of the region-based navigation spec, where you can say that not only something is a region, but that region is a panel, or that region is a speech bubble. So since we're building a superset, of course, we want to make sure that everything possible in media overlay and everything possible in region-based navigation will be exposed and will work with that guided navigation API. So in practice, what does this look like? So let's say that I have a comic and I've decided that for that comic, it's useful to do panel navigation. So instead of having just a page, you'll have the ability to, at any point, switch to a different display mode where it's using the guided navigation API. So the simplest presentation that this could be doing is, instead of showing you the entire page, it will move and just show you a panel. So that's a pretty basic implementation, and that is similar to what is possible with region-based navigation. But if you go a little bit beyond that, that panel can actually include text. For example, it could include the text that you have in this speech bubble. So instead of having just a region, we'll also have text. As a reading system, so someone building a reading app, you could also display the text below that panel, which could be very useful. This can be useful for a number of reasons. Text could be not so high quality and hard to read. It could be using a font that is not ideal for your reader. So having the ability to include text and then display set text under or wherever you want next to the panel basically allows you to customize the text. I could use different fonts. I could let the user decide if they want to have a larger or smaller text. You know, all the benefits you get from a reflowable EPUB, you could also do that with a panel here. And if you go even a step beyond that, not only could I display the text next to the panel, but I could actually also include a description. So in addition to have the text equivalent of the speech bubble, I could also embed the description of the panel, so which is what you have here. Diva removes her headphone. And if you even want to go beyond text, this panel could also have a reference to an audio fragment, so real human reading that. So you could very easily combine an experience where you have text that is conveyed using text-to-speech or screen reader with text audio recorded by someone that is read aloud. And so to do that, it's pretty simple. It means that we would have 4 equivalents here in this page. You would have a region defining the panel, a text equivalent of that. So that's what I showed in the previous slide. A description, which is also text that provides a description of the image, and then a reference to an audio fragment that could be read. So that's a pretty advanced example, but you'll see it's not just fantasy, as you'll see with Morten's presentation right afterward. So what do we plan on doing now that we have a pretty good idea of what we want to build with this guided navigation API and concept overall? So we're gonna add support for this new model and this new API, both in Readium Mobile, which is available for iOS, Android, Chrome OS, iPadOS, macOS, but also for Readium Web, which is still in development, not as mature. So we want to make sure that for implementers, so apps using Readium Mobile and Readium Web, there's going to be built-in capacity for parsing media overlay, parsing region-based navigation and exposing that through a simple API that really makes it very easy for app developers to support all the things that I've just showed in the previous slides. Of course, we want to support that in existing content. So a lot of it is fixed layout, but we also want to support that in the reflow. So we know that there's not a lot of EPUB production right now with media overlay on reflow. Hopefully this will grow over time, and we'll make sure that not only is this supported with fixed layout, but also reflow, because we think there's a bit of a wasted potential here. We also have planned to build what we call the new navigator. So the navigator is the engine in the Readium toolkit, and we have an engine for each format. Over the last few years, we've built navigator for EPUB fixed layout, for PDF, for audiobook. And we think it's time to build one specifically for bande dessinée, comics, manga, webtoons. So our intent is also to create a new reading experience specifically for those media, and of course, implement guided navigation for that too. So either using regional navigation or something more native to those formats. And of course, we will make it possible to provide alternate text and audio on any fragment. So that's what I was showing with the example of the Overwatch comics, but this will be exposed completely by this new API. So whenever we do something new in Readium toolkits, we always go towards something higher level as an API, and sometimes this is also something that can be used for production. Here, we're targeting first and foremost the ability to support media overlay and region-based navigation, but we're also investigating how this could be used for formats, specialized formats for comics like CBZ, CBR, because we think there is a need not just to cover EPUB, but also those formats, since they're so widely used in the comic space. And that's all for me. I'm going to let Morten show you a bit more. He's going to be a little less about theory and a bit more about how this is actually used already out there in production in his organization. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I'll just have to share my screen here for 1 moment. If I can find it. Yes, so I'll start by just presenting who Nota is. We are the Danish Library and Experience Center for people with print disability. We provide reading materials for people with dyslexia and people with visual impairment, and other Danes who cannot read printed text. We have 241,000 members. The vast majority have dyslexia. And our collection is, well, you can see on the screen. The vast majority of books are audiobooks at the moment, almost the same number of ebooks, and we have a very small collection of comic books, 200 which are narrated. And these comic books are limited because we own the process to produce them is pretty slow, because the current process is manual and takes a long time. They're packaged in a in-house format, wrapped in Daisy, and for our new reading app, in a web publication with the old media overlays. The rendering is pretty heavy on JavaScript and not very flexible. So then we process a comic book in the old way. We start by taking the physical comic book. It is cut up physically. The pages are scanned. All the miscolorings, alignment have to be manually corrected in Photoshop, and image maps are created in GIMP, and we manually have to decide the reading order. This takes 1 or 2 days manual work to do the image mapping and combining this image map with the metadata of the book, which is title, author, all these things. Then the generated product have to be proofread and converted into a DAISY. After this, it is set in the queue to be narrated by professional actors. In the new setup, we have partnered with the GeoComics. This is a company that creates have created an AI to process the comic books for translation, but they produce a comic book markup language file that have all the information we need to produce the panels, reading order, and the AI generally does it really good. So we save a lot of manual labor on that. This file is then converted by an internal system to DAISY, and we still have to check the manual files. But now, instead of having 1 or 2 days manual work, it still takes 1 or 2 days, but the system does it, so we can use the time for something else. And as Hadrien explained with his format, we are how to say that? We're looking into switching to from our in-house format to the guided navigation once that is published, and we have looking into other accessibility features we could add. And with GeoComics, we hope to produce the Donald Duck weekly magazine from Danish for the younger audience, in the hope that they can attract more of the kids to actually use our services, because they're difficult to get to reading books. We are looking into adding the caption that you saw from Hadrien's presentation. And this we can get from the GeoComics production, because they do some OCR on images. And we hope to increase the production rate. And it would be really great to be able to add image descriptions to the panels and pages. So I have, whoops. I have a small demo, but it will be static prints, because we know it works. So this is a proof of concept I wrote for a proposed format, that is close to guided navigation that I have converted to the new format. So this is one of our comic books, Nofrat, Gravrøverne, which means grave robbers. And in rendering, we can make this black and white for people with visual impairment. So this is a small filter we apply that removes the colors and tries to turn it into a simplified drawing. Because people or members with visual impairment, but still have some sight left, might be able to read this better. And yeah, as you may be able to see, we have the balloon marked here, and we have a small caption down here to demo the concept. And this comic this page can also be turned black and white. And the same with this panel. So yeah, I don't have much else. So we really hope to be able to produce many more comic books for our readers and use this new guided navigation. So, yes, I think that quick presentation was what I had.
There is, oh, let me,
Yeah.
There's one question from Laura Brady about sharing your proof of concept. So I think your proof of concept is public, Morten. So you.
Yes, it is. You can see it here.
So you
I'm sorry, I don't share the screen anymore.
No,
Sorry.
you can send a link, I think, in the chat and otherwise in the resources. But yeah, it's something that can be tested live. So basically, what it does is that usually you see the full page, and then it zooms in on specific panels, and you can also hear the audio being played at the same time. So not all panels have audio, some of them do. So it's one of the things where actually we kind of have to think about. So when it comes to guided navigation, you have very passive user experience, for example, media overlay, where you press play and then you just listen and you don't have to do anything. And then you have a bit more active guided navigation style, for example, panel by panel navigation, where the user still has to tap on the screen or, press the arrow key to go back and forth. And one of the things that we kind of have to think about, especially for comics, is what happens if you have panels where you don't have audio. Like, do you stay there for a fixed number of seconds, or do you wait until the user is ready to move to the next thing? And this is kind of, this is forcing us to think about this in beyond just the question of media overlay on, let's call it media overlay on comics. Even for the current use of media overlay right now, I'm not always convinced that it's such a good thing that it's going to be turning pages on its own. There might be a case where you have a spread where it's nice that a kid can hear what is read aloud, but they might want to spend a bit more time in the book looking at the picture that is on one side of the spread. So one thing we're considering with this whole guided navigation concept is to have different modes, like a mode that is where everything happens automatically. So basically, if you just press play, then it'll go through the entire publication, but also mode that are kind of in between. For example, it only starts playing the audio when you turn the page or when you get to the next step in the navigation. And we kind of think that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. If you only do one, if you only do the complete playback in the background thing, it's not going to work for everyone. And then the other way around, if you ask people to interact a lot, it might not be a good fit for other types of audience. So as part of this work, we're kind of exploring allowing users to decide what they want to do. Like, do you want page and things to progress on their own, or do you want to be in charge and then only play the audio when you decide that you want to go to the next step? So yeah, that's a good example where some of the thing we were, I wouldn't say struggling, but considering for publication that are primarily image-based, kind of help us to also improve the audio part, for example, on EPUB, on reflowable EPUB.
Yeah, because with what we do today at Nota, that the panels without text, we have a hard-coded time frame. It's just in the audio file. So the panel has an ID, and there's just blank audio for a number of seconds in the audio file. And that would be nice to have something a little more flexible.
Yeah, because it's hard to say if the user will need to stay on the panel for, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, or 10 minutes. I mean, they might like the panel so much, they want to see the details, or, or something is difficult for them to understand. So yeah, we really think that there needs to be control over that.
Yeah, and in our case, it also makes the comic book more difficult to read for people with visual impairment, because it's just blank. If they can't see the image at all, it's just a break. There's no audio indication of anything, and in the current model, we don't have any descriptions.
That is correct, and I think one part of the experience that will be provided by this API is that for each step in the guided navigation, you'll know exactly what you have. So for example, if someone is consuming that publication with a screen reader, you could, for example, indicate that something doesn't have an image description or an audio equivalent, which is not the best, but it might be better to indicate that to that person than have them wait without knowing what's going on.
Exactly.
So the more context, the more control we provide, the better we think it'll be in that regard. Do we have any other question? Don't think I saw more questions, but.
We don't have more questions, but I think we have just a message in the chat from Pedro Minier. Questions are arriving in the chat. Pedro Minier, I'm thinking about very complex infographics and textbook that could really benefit from this concept.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. You could basically walk someone through a complex infographics by showing them fragment of it at a time, deciding in which order you show them. And well, if you have audio, you can synchronize that with audio. If you have description, you could include description. But yeah, I think so. You'll notice one thing is that we didn't said accessibility too much in this presentation. It's pretty obvious that there are some use cases for accessibility, but I don't think it's just for accessibility. We think there's a lot of benefits potential for anyone reading those publications. The obvious example is try reading a French or Belgian, I must say Belgium, because otherwise Marie-Laurence is going to do angry eyes in my direction, type of bande dessinée. Try reading that on the phone. It's very difficult. So the ability to cut things down into, fragments that might be better displayed, and this is actually helpful for everyone. And we think the same for media overlay. I think there's no reason why media overlay should be limited to strictly accessibility use case. We see audio is going up in terms of usage. It's just a bit of shame that we don't have more of those multi-modal audio plus text publication out there, outside of today's world, of course.
We have another question from Den van der Tok in the chat. I invite you to read them.
Given how few ebooks that use media overlays, what tools would be available for authoring these books? Because the document standard and the reader seems not enough. Okay, that's a good question. I see that someone has answered. So I think there are going to be a bunch of options. So what Morten mentioned, you mentioned GeoComics. So GeoComics is a company out there that uses machine learning to detect panels, speech bubbles, characters, that is capable of extracting with, not just OCR, but something a bit more advanced, content of speech bubbles or sounds. So this is one way you could automate the production of that by detecting those things and then ordering them. So I think there are going to be some tools that help you automate that. It's too early for me to mention who, but I've also heard from a developer working on a very popular comics reading app on iOS that is interested in building an authoring app free for everyone to use. So something where, as a comic creator, you could load your content, you could, use your finger or an Apple Pencil and just draw the regions you want to draw, and include those descriptions and text equivalent. So hopefully those are two good examples. And I see that Lars mentions that there's actually something in Circular Flow for handling region-based navigation, which would be supported too. Oh, and Ken Jones is actually here. So yeah, I do see quite a bit of potential mix of tools to help with regions and guided navigation. I think one thing that hasn't been explored and used widely enough for media overlay is that there are tools for doing what we called automated alignment. So you give it audio, you give it text, and it generates automatically for you the alignment. So there are open source tools out there that can be used to do that. So if you have an audiobook and an ebook, using those tools, you could potentially generate automatically something that looks like a media overlay that might require a bit more work, but that could help you a lot. And I don't think this is used that much in the DAISY world. You might know that better than I do, Morten, the automated alignment tools. But I think there's a lot of potential in using automated alignments for producing more massively media overlay or anything that aligns text with audio.
Yeah, we've only talked about it. We haven't really looked into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was actually a good transition, because unfortunately we are going to have to end the session here, because there is indeed another session about no-code accessibility for InDesign presented by Ken Jones, which is starting in 5 minutes. So we'll have to stop here, but thank you again to both of our speakers. We can see that this presentation is already sparking discussion, so I hope you can continue talking about it in the lobby chat, for instance, until the end of the week. And otherwise, feel free to reach out to them in order to talk about this further. Thank you again, Morten. Thank you again, Hadrien, for your presentation. And we'll see you on the next presentation by Ken Jones. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey.